The Knife Istanbul, 2016. Before long, Perry caught sight of the beggars who had snatched her handbag. Although they had escaped as fast as their feet could carry them, she was quicker than they were. She couldn't believe her luck, if luck it was. She raced after them into a cobbled alleyway, its stone walls rising from the shadows, her chest burning with each breath. The children were there, standing on either side of a man, the tramp who had smoked the rest of her cigarette. Perry took a step towards them, but could not speak. She had acted without thinking, and, now that she was thinking, she felt disorientated. The tramp smiled serenely, as if he had been expecting her. Up close, hello, okay, different, the gaunt lines of his cheekbones perfectly symmetrical, a youthful glow from the inky depths of his eyes. Were it not for the wretchedness of his appearance, one might have said there was a hint of Andy about him. On his lap he held her handbag reverently, caressing it like a long-lost lover. That's mine, Perry said, her voice tight as she swallowed the knot that rose in her throat. At this he opened the clasp and held the handbag in the air before turning it upside down. Its contents spilled out: house keys, lipstick, eyeliner, a pen, a miniature bottle of perfume, a mobile phone, a pack of tissues, a pair of sunglasses, a hairbrush, a tampon, and a leather wallet. This he picked up gingerly. From inside, he pulled out a wad of banknotes, credit cards, a woman's pink ID, a driving license, family photos of favorite memories. Whistling all the while, he pocketed the money and the phone, ignoring the other items. It emitted a carefree, chirpy melody that sounded like a tune from an old music box. Just as he was about to throw away the wallet, something caught his eye. A Polaroid, which had partially slipped out from a compartment where it had been carefully tucked away, hidden from view. A relic from a time long gone. Raising an eyebrow, the tramp studied the Polaroid. There were 4 faces there, a man and 3 young women. A professor and his students. Wrapped in coats, hats, and scarves, they stood with their backs to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, huddled together for warmth or out of habit, forever trapped inside one of the coldest days of that winter. The tramp lifted his head and grinned at Perry as if he had recognized Oxford from a film or a newspaper clipping. Or he might just as well have noticed that one of the girls in the snap was the woman now standing in front of him. She had gained weight and wrinkles, her hair was shorter and straighter, but her eyes were the same, barring the hint of sadness. He tossed the photo aside. Perry watched for a few seconds, no more, the Polaroid fly into the air, then flutter to the ground. She flinched as though the photo were alive and might have been hurt in the fall. Panicking, she shouted to the tramp that people were on their way to Helfer, the police, the gendarmerie, her husband. She waved her hand to show her wedding ring, painfully aware in that moment that the girl she once was would have mocked her for flaunting the symbol of her marital status as if it were an amulet. But there were enough reasons the man would not believe her, not least the catch in her voice. The alley was deserted, the light draining from the sky. How far had she strayed from the main road? She could still hear the sound of traffic, but it was muffled, as though coming from behind a glass wall. Suddenly she was afraid. The tramp was motionless for an awkward moment. So still was the air that Perry thought she could make out the scuttle of a mouse in the pile of rubbish nearby, rummaging while its heart, no bigger than a pistachio, drummed in its tiny chest. The alley felt outside the realm of Istanbul's cats, outside the city borders, and, in that instant, outside this world. Calmly, the man fished for something in his coat pocket and pulled it out. It was a plastic bag containing a tiny tube of solvent. He took the tube and squeezed the entire contents into the bag. Next he blew air into it, making a small balloon. He smiled at his creation, an idyllic snow globe in which every flake of snow that ever fell was either diamond or pearl. Placing it over his nose and mouth, he inhaled heavily, once, twice, then a longer third time. When he raised his head again, his expression had altered, there and not there. He was a glue addict, Perry understood. Only now did she notice the broken blood vessels in his eyeballs, like cracks on scorched earth. A voice inside told her to go back to her daughter and her car, but she stood so still the adhesive might just as well have been spilled onto her feet, fixing her to the spot. The tramp offered the plastic bag to one of the children, who, in her excitement, almost snatched it from him. She huffed noisily while the other girl waited her turn, impatient and irritated at being the last. Glue, the favorite treat of street children and underage prostitutes, the magic carpet that carried them, as light as feathers, over the roofs and domes and skyscrapers into a far-off kingdom where there was no fear and no reason for fear, no pain, no prisons, no pimps. They stayed in that Eden for as long as they could, sucking golden grapes off the stalks, nibbling on juicy peaches. Safe from hunger and cold, they chased ogres, jeered at giants and stuffed genies back into the bottles from which they had escaped. Like all sweet dreams, this one, too, came with a price. The glue dissolved the membrane of their brain cells, attacked their nervous systems, destroyed their kidneys and livers, devouring them, inch by inch, from inside. "I'm calling the police," Perry yelled, louder than needed. Not the right thing to say, she thought to herself, and added, even louder, "My daughter Salriti called. They'll be here any minute." As if that were his cue, the tramp rose to his feet. His moves were slow and deliberate, perhaps to give her enough time to change her mind, or else to make it clear that none of what was about to happen was his fault. The two children were nowhere to be seen. When they had left and where they had gone, Perry had no idea. They followed the orders of the tramp. He was the sultan of the back streets, the emperor of uncollected rubbish and open cesspools, of everything unwanted and abandoned, the magnanimous collector of it all. Not his features but the intensity with which he carried himself reminded Perry of someone she thought she had left locked in the past, someone she had loved like she had loved no one else. Tearing her gaze away from the man, for a second or so, Perry glanced at the Polaroid on the ground. It was one of the few photos from her time at Oxford that she had kept over the years, and the only photo of Professor Asa. She could not afford to lose it. When she looked back, she was startled to see that the tramp's nose was bleeding. Thick drops of blood splattered his chest, a scarlet so bright it resembled paint. Still shuffling towards her, he didn't seem to be aware of it. Perry heard a gasp, her own voice unfamiliar to her ears, as she caught sight of a glint of steel. The toy Istanbul, 1980s. They came late on a Friday night. Like owls, they waited for the evening to throw a black mantle over the city before seeking their prey. Perry's mother, who had gone to bed past midnight, after cooking one of her specialties, slow-roasted lamb with mint leaves, was the last to hear the pounding on their front door. By the time Selma was up and awake, the police were already inside the house, ransacking the room her sons shared. After Thuride, as though incapable of forgiving herself, Selma would never again have a full night's sleep. She would become a nocturnal creature herself. Although the police were examining every last item, it was clear from their behavior that they were here for the older son, Umit. They made him stand alone in a corner, and forbade him to exchange even a glance with his family. Seeing him in this state, 7-year-old Perry felt a sadness so pure that it bordered on despair. This she had never voiced aloud, but Umit was her favorite brother. Large, hazel eyes that crinkled around the corners with every smile, a wide forehead that made him look wiser than his years. Like her, he had a tendency to blush easily. Unlike her, he was full of good spirits, as befitted his name, Hope. Despite the age gap between them, Umit had always been close to Perry, playing along with her silly games for no reason but love, pretending to be a kidnapped prince aboard a pirate ship or a scheming wizard atop the mountain cough, whatever the story of the day called for. At university, chemical engineering, Umit had become somewhat withdrawn. He grew a luxuriant, walrus-like mustache, and put up on his walls pictures of people Perry had never seen before, a grandfather with a hoary beard, a man with round wire spectacles and an open face, another with wild hair and a dark beret. There was also a woman with pinned-up hair and a white hat. When Perry had asked who they were, her brother had explained, "That is Marx, the other, Gramsci. The one with the beret is Comrade Cheo, Perry had said, clueless as to what he was talking about but affected by the ardor in his voice. How about her? Rosa, I wish my name were Rosa. Umit had smiled. Your name is more beautiful, believe me, but, if you wish, I'll call you Rosa Perry. Maybe you'll be a revolutionary. What's a revolutionary? Umit had paused, searching for an appropriate answer. Someone who wants every child to have toys and no child to have too many. Okay, Perry had said guardedly. She had liked half of what she had heard, disliked the other half. How many is too many? Laughing, Umit had ruffled her hair, her question lingering in the space between them, unanswered. Now it was the same posters that the police were ripping off the walls. When there was nothing left to shred, they checked the books, all of which belonged to Umit, as Hakan was not much of a reader. The Communist Manifesto by Karl Marx, The Condition of the Working Class in England by Friedrich Engels, The Permanent Revolution by Leon Trotsky, Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, Utopia by Thomas More, Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. Flicking through the pages with a look of irritated frustration, they seemed to be hunting for personal letters and notes. Though they uncovered none, they still confiscated the books. Why are you reading this shit? The police chief grabbed a book, The Kiss of the Spider Woman, and shook it in Umit's direction. You are a Muslim Turk. Your father is a Muslim Turk, your mother is a Muslim Turk. 7 generations, the same. What is it to you, huh, all this foreign crap? Umit stared at his bare feet, his toes, round and clean, pressed against one another as though for safety. If they have a problem, damn Westerners, it's their problem, the man said. In our country everyone is happy. We don't have classes over here. We don't even know what the word means. Did you ever hear someone ask, hey, what's your class? Of course not. We are all Muslim and we are all Turks. Full stop. Same religion, same nationality, same everything. Which part of that don't you get? The inspector moved close to Umit, leaning forward as if to sniff him. This country had 3 military takeovers to put an end to such bullshit. Now it's cropping up again. You think we'll allow it? Your books are full of lies. They're written in venom. Maybe you've been poisoned, have you? Umit said nothing. I'm asking you a question, imbecile, the man yelled, his nostrils flaring. Have you been poisoned? I said. No, Umit replied, his voice barely a whisper. I think you have, said the man, nodding in agreement with himself. You certainly look like you have. The mattresses, the wardrobe, the drawers, even inside the wood-burning stove. No nook, no cranny went uninspected. Whatever they were looking for they seemed unable to find, which made them angrier. They're hiding it. Search the rest of the house, ordered the police chief. He was smoking one cigarette after another, flicking the ashes on the floor. Excuse me, hiding what exactly? Mensur ventured, his thinning hair tousled, his striped pajamas rumpled, slippers on his feet, from the opposite corner of the room where the rest of the family had been made to it. I'll shove it up your arse when we find it, the police chief replied. As if I don't know. Wincing at the harshness of the words, Perry held her father's hand. But her eyes were fixed on her brother. She worried for Umit, whose face had turned as pale as a waning moon. The police riffled through the other bedrooms, the bathroom, the toilet, the pantry where they kept the okras they had dried and the cucumbers they had pickled. From inside the kitchen came the sounds of drawers being opened, boxes grubbed about in, cutlery tossed around. Where once had been neatly ordered shelves with lace trim, now there was disarray. An hour passed, maybe more. Outside, the faintest strip of light broke through the leaden sky, like a baby tooth cutting through raw flesh. What about the girl? Asked the police chief. He flicked the cigarette button to the carpet and crushed it with the heel of his shoe. Did you check her toys? Selma, her gaze fixed on the carpet she had cleaned earlier in the day, interjected, there must be a misunderstanding, Efendim *, ours is a decent family. We are all God-fearing people. Ignoring the comment, the man turned to Perry. Where are your things, child? Show us. Perry's eyes widened. Why was everyone interested in her toys? Not that she had too many, the revolutionaries, the police. I'm not telling you. Mensur, still holding Perry's hand, pulled his daughter back and murmured, hush. Let them look, we have nothing to worry about. Then, directing his words at no one in particular, he said, she keeps them in a trunk under her bed. A few minutes later, when the police chief re-emerged with his men behind him, it was the expression on his face more than the object he held between his fingertips that alarmed Perry. Well, what do we have here? Perry had never seen a gun before. In contrast to those on TV, this one seemed so small and cute that for a moment she wondered if it were made of chocolate hidden inside a cradle. Under a dolly. How convenient. I swear on the Holy Quran, we know nothing about this, said Selma, her voice brittle. Of course you don't, woman, but your son does. It's not mine, Umit said, his cheeks flushed. They asked me to keep it for a few days. I was going to return it tomorrow. Who are they? Asked the police chief. He sounded happy. Umit took a ragged breath, sinking into silence. Outside rose the incantation of the muezzin calling from a nearby mosque, there is no God but God. Prayer is better than sleep. All right, off we go, ordered the police chief. Take him in. Mensur, whose face had frozen at the sight of the gun, said, please, there must be an explanation. My son is a good boy. He'd never hurt anyone. The police chief, who had taken a few steps towards the door, turned back on his heels. Always the same crap. You don't keep an eye on your children, they mingle with godless communist bastards, they get themselves into all sorts of shit. When it's too late, you wail and beg. Wah. What do you make babies if you won't take care of them, you fucking morons, can't control your dicks. With an abrupt move the police chief grabbed Mensur's pajama bottoms and pulled them down to his knees, revealing crisp white, though slightly worn, underwear. A couple of policemen chuckled at the sight. Others feigned indifference. Perry felt the energy in her father's hand ebb, his fingers grew light and bloodless, the hand of a cadaver waiting to be dissected. Her father's silence, her father's shame, her father whom she had adored, revered, loved and idolized since the day she had uttered her first word. By the time Mensur, trembling, had pulled up his pajama bottoms, the police officers were through the door, taking Umit with them. The family would not see Umit for 7 weeks, during which he remained in solitary confinement. Charged with membership of an illegal communist organization, he had confessed to owning the gun, after he was stripped naked, blindfolded, strapped onto a metal bed frame and given electric shocks. When the electrodes were attached to his testicles and the voltage was doubled, he admitted to being the leader of a cell that was plotting a series of assassinations of state officials. The acrid smell of charred flesh, the coppery smell of blood, the tart smell of urine and the cinnamon smell of the chewing gum of his chief torturer, an officer named Hose Hassan, so called because of his inventive torture techniques with a garden hose. Each time Umit passed out he was revived with cold water and soaked with buckets of salt water to increase the conductivity. In the mornings, the same police officers would apply medicinal ointment to his injuries so that they could continue the abuse in the afternoon. As he rubbed the balm into Umut's wounds, Hose Hassan would complain about his low salary and lengthy working hours, and how his daughter had eloped with an older man who was a father to a child and a husband to another woman. The lovebird Shad returned, 6 months later, stone broke and scared. He could have killed them there and then, instead, he had spared their lives. Like many professional torturers, he was kind to his relatives, respectful to his superiors and cruel to everyone else. In between sessions, Umit was made to listen to the screams of other prisoners, just as they were made to listen to his own. Again and again, the national anthem would blare out over loudspeakers. Once, during an electric shock, they forgot to put a towel in his mouth, a simple oversight. The family would not see Umit for 7 weeks, during which he remained in solitary confinement. Charged with membership of an illegal communist organization, he had confessed to owning the gun, after he was stripped naked, blindfolded, strapped onto a metal bed frame and given electric shocks. When the electrodes were attached to his testicles and the voltage was doubled, he admitted to being the leader of a cell that was plotting a series of assassinations of state officials. The acrid smell of charred flesh, the coppery smell of blood, the tart smell of urine and the cinnamon smell of the chewing gum of his chief torturer, an officer named Hose Hassan, so called because of his inventive torture techniques with a garden hose. Each time Umit passed out he was revived with cold water and soaked with buckets of salt water to increase the conductivity. In the mornings, the same police officers would apply medicinal ointment to his injuries so that they could continue the abuse in the afternoon. As he rubbed the balm into Umut's wounds, Hose Hassan would complain about his low salary and lengthy working hours, and how his daughter had eloped with an older man who was a father to a child and a husband to another woman. The lovebird Shad returned, 6 months later, stone broke and scared. He could have killed them there and then, instead, he had spared their lives. Like many professional torturers, he was kind to his relatives, respectful to his superiors and cruel to everyone else. In between sessions, Umit was made to listen to the screams of other prisoners, just as they were made to listen to his own. Again and again, the national anthem would blare out over loudspeakers. Once, during an electric shock, they forgot to put a towel in his mouth, a simple oversight. And he bit through his tongue, almost severing it in two. For a long time eating was a wretched experience. He could taste food only when he swallowed it. Torture, widely practiced in prisons, detention centers, and young offender institutions across the country in the aftermath of the 1980 coup d'état, was said to have slowed down by then, but it carried on just the same. Old habits died hard. Not that there were no changes. Falaka, the beating of the soles of feet, was, for the most part, replaced by suspension by the arms for hours, a cleaner method that left fewer marks. Burning with cigarettes and the extraction of nails or healthy teeth were also outdated. Shocks were quick, efficient, and left almost no traces. So forcing prisoners to eat their own excrement, drink each other's urine or spend hours in septic tanks. No visible signs of maltreatment. Nothing for Nazi journalists or Western human rights activists to detect, should they appear without warning. Eventually, Umit was sentenced to 8 years and 4 months without parole. After the verdict was announced, the Nalbantaglus paid regular visits to the prison on the outskirts of Istanbul. They arrived in varying combinations, depending on the day: Mensur with his younger son, Selma with her daughter, Mensur with his daughter, but never Mensur and Selma together. With dozens of other people they would sit at a wide, plastic table whose surface bore the marks of hundreds of anxious, painful encounters. They would keep their hands visible, as instructed, to make sure nothing was exchanged. In this state, they would try to mend the whole of silence with smiles that did not reach their eyes and words that snapped and slipped out of their grasp. On one occasion, when Umit stood up to leave, Mensur noticed a stain of blood on the lower back of his son's prison uniform. A blot the size and shape of a willow leaf. It had a name, the torture method that had caused it: bloody coke. Beaten and stripped, the inmates were forced to sit on a Coca-Cola bottle. It was said to be a cocktail served to a select few political prisoners, suspected gays, and transsexuals rounded up from the streets. Mensur stared at the stain, dazed. He let out a gulping cry, gasping for breath, despite a desperate effort to keep himself composed. Fortunately Umit, already back in his ward, had not heard him. But Peri, whose turn it had been to accompany her father on that day, certainly had. She witnessed the entire scene, though for some reason it was only images, as if she were watching a silent film, that would stay with her. After that day, Mensur forbade Peri to visit prison. She should sit at home instead and write letters to her brother. She should tell him heartwarming, touching stories, small details of joy to give him faith in the human spirit. This Peri did for as long as she could. She composed letters with a delight she did not feel, about people she had barely met and incidents that had not quite happened in the way she described. Umit, as if he could see through the deceit, never responded. He would often appear in her dreams, however, from which she would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming. Sometimes she would manage to go back to sleep. Other times, she would slip out of bed, climb into her wardrobe and close the door from inside, trying to imagine what a prison cell must feel like. As she listened to her heart beating in that dark confined space, and fearful that the oxygen was slowly running out, she would pretend her brother was beside her, breathing. The horror of having Umut behind walls, instead of uniting the Nalbantoglus, distanced them from each other to the point of mutual enmity. Mensur blamed his wife. He was at work all day long, he argued. It was Selma who was supposed to have kept an eye on their son. Had she spent less time with fanatical preachers who promised her the sent-off paradise and been more attentive to what went on under her nose, she might have prevented the calamity that had befallen them. Reticent, sullen, resentful, Selma, meanwhile, held her husband responsible. It was Mensur who had sowed seeds of godlessness into the mind of their son. All his soliloquies on materialism and free-thinking had led to this disaster. Over the years, Mensur and Selma's marriage had hardened into a hollow husk. Now the shell cracked wide open and they found themselves on separate sides of the rift. The air inside the house turned stifling, heavy, as if it had absorbed the sadness of its inhabitants. It seemed to young Perry thought no sooner had the bees and the moths entered through the open windows than they rushed in panic to fly out. Even those insatiable mosquitoes no longer sucked the Nalbantoglus' blood, for fear of ingesting their unhappiness. In the cartoons and movies that Perry watched, ordinary mortals were bitten by spiders, stung by hornets, after which they would transform into superheroes and lead exciting lives. In their case it was the other way round. Fleas and bugs, after coming into contact with the Nalbantoglus, metamorphosed into the ways of humans, crushed by the weight of feelings for which they had no use. It was around those days that Perry began to reframe her relationship with Allah. She stopped praying before going to sleep, contrary to the way her mother taught her, but she also refused to remain indifferent towards the Almighty, contrary to her father's advice. Instead, all the anguish and hurt she dared not to voice within earshot of her parents, she turned into a cannonball of words and hurled headlong at the skies. She began to quarrel with God. Perry argued with him about everything, asking questions to which Sheikh knew there were no easy answers, asking all the same, in a lowered voice so that no one could hear. How irresponsible of him to allow terrible things to happen to those who didn't deserve it. Could God see and hear through prison walls and across cell bars? If he could not, he was not all-powerful. If he could, and still did nothing to help those in need, he was not merciful. Either way, he was not what he claimed to be. He was an impostor. The anger Perry couldn't direct at her mother and her master Uzumbasfandi, the frustration she couldn't hold against her father and his drinking habits, the sorrow she couldn't convey to her elder brother and the weariness she felt towards her other brother, she mixed them all into a gooey batter and poured it into her thoughts on God. There it baked, in the furnace of her mind, rising slowly, cracking in the middle, burning around the edges. While her friends seemed as uncomplicated and light as the kites they flew, playing in the streets, joking around at school and taking every day as it came, Nazbari Nalbantoglu, an unusually intense and introverted child, was busily searching for God. God, a simple word with an obscure meaning. God, close enough to know everything you did, or even considered doing, yet impossible to react. But Perry was determined to find a way. For she had come to believe through some twisted logic of her own that if she were to bring together her mother's creator and her father's creator, she might be able to restore a harmony between her parents. With some kind of agreement as to what God was or was not, there would be less tension in the Nalbantoglu household even across the world. God was a maze without a map, a circle without a center, the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that never seemed to fit together. If only she could solve this mystery, she could bring meaning to senselessness, reason to madness, order to chaos, and perhaps, too, she could learn to be happy. The Notebook, Istanbul, 1980s. Come and sit with me, love, Mensur said to his daughter one rare evening when he was alone at the dinner table. Perry immediately did as told. She had missed him terribly. Although in the same house, he had been distant, absorbed in his own thoughts, a mere shell of the man he used to be ever since the day Umit was arrested. Let me tell you a story, Mensur said. Once, there lived a reed flute player in Istanbul, a Sufi but of the maverick kind. Whenever he saw a bottle of raki or wine, he'd scold those around him. Don't you know a drop off this liquor is a sin? Then he'd open the bottle, dip his finger inside, wait a few seconds, and take his finger out, dripping. I removed that sinful drop, he'd say. Now we can drink in peace. Mensur chuckled at his own words, a low, sad laugh. Perry studied her father, sensing in his question a lonely rebellion, viewed against what or whom. Tentatively, she asked, Baba, may I try it? What? You want to drink raki? Perry nodded. She had never given it a moment's thought before, but, now that she said she wanted it, she really did. It was a way of bonding with her father. Mensur shook his head. You are only 7. No way. 8, Perry corrected him. I'll be 8 this month. Well, I've always said better to have your first taste of alcohol at home with your parents than secretly outside. You shouldn't really drink before you're 18, Mensur mused. By that time, who knows if it'll be a load, thanks to those religious fanatics. Maybe they'll put a bottle or two on display somewhere. The exhibition of degenerate objects. Just like the Nazis and modern art, Yes, maybe you should take a sip before it's too late. Thus saying, Mensur filled a glass with water and added a generous splash of raki. While Perry watched the alcohol disperse in the water, her father watched her with a tender expression. See these drops? That's me and my mates. We dissolve in a sea of ignorance. Mensur raised his glass, and said, Shurf. Thrilled to be treated like an adult, Perry smiled. Shurf. If your mother sees us, she'll skin me alive in haste. Perry took a mouthful. Her face instantly twisted in disgust. It was dreadful. It was worse than anything she had ever tried. The bite ofteness, sharper even than its smell, burned her tongue, tickled her nose, brought tears to her eyes. How could her father drink this awful stuff every evening with such relish? Promise me, Mensur said, paying no heed to his daughter's reaction. Never buy into old wives' tales, if you know what I mean. Yes, yes, Perry said, after she had knocked back a glass of water and gulped a slice of bread to get rid of the taste in her mouth. Like when they say, don't jump over a child, he'll stop growing. If you crack your knuckles you'll break an angel's wings. Whistle in the dark, you'll invite shaitan. That kind of thing. That's right, all that nonsense. Listen, there's a rule I've come to respect and I advise you to do the same. Never believe anything you haven't seen with your eyes, heard with your ears, touched with your hands and grasped with your mind. Promise. Eager to please her father, Perry chirped, I promise, Baba. Pleased, Mensur beat his index finger in the air to accentuate his words. Education will save us. It's the only way forward. You must go to the best university in the world. He paused as he considered which university that might be. You are the only one among my children who can do this. Work hard. Save yourself from ignorance. Bigger promise. Bigger promise. There is one problem, though, Mensur said. Men don't want women too clever or too educated. I wouldn't want you to die a spinster. It's okay, I'm never going to get married. I'll stay with you. Mensur burst into laughter. Trust me, you don't want to do that. Just don't give your heart to anyone who doesn't care about science, knowledge. Biggest promise. Biggest promise. Perry slid down in her chair as a new thought entered her mind. What about God? We can't see him, can't hear him, can't touch him, but should we still believe in him? Mensur looked rueful. I'll let you in on a secret. When it comes to the Almighty, grown-ups are no less confused than kids. But is God real? Perry insisted he'd better be. When I meet him in the next world, before he has a go at me, I'll ask him where he's been all this time. He's left us to our own devices for too long. Mensur popped a slice of cheese into his mouth and should vigorously Baba. Why didn't Allah help Umit? Why did he let all this happen? I don't know, my soul, Mensur said, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. They fell quiet. Perry curled her toes and pressed her slippered feet on the carpet, sensing it would be wiser to change the subject. The mention of Harolder brother had darkened the already dim mood, like a cloud that drifts across the pale moon. What about heaven and hell? The trials and tribulations of hell had been a constant refrain throughout her education. The idea that her father might find himself in the abode of the damned with its boiling cauldrons, its punishing flames and its dark angels called Zabanister terrified her. Well, I'm not really heaven material, no. There are two possibilities: if God has no sense of humor, I'm doomed. Express train to hell. If he hasten, there's hope, I might join you in paradise. They say they have rivers flowing with the best wine. A wave of alarm swept over Perry. But what if Allah is as stern as Mother always says he is? She whispered. Don't fret, we'll have a plan B, said Mensur. Make sure you put a pickaxe in my grave. I'll dig a tunnel out of wherever I end up. Perry's eyes widened. Hell is so deep, if you throw a pebble it takes 70 years for it to reach the bottom. Mother told me. I am sure she did. A silent sigh. Here's the good thing, a year on earth is only a minute in the afterworld. One way or another, I'll come and find you. His face brightened. Oh, I almost forgot. I've got something for you. From his leather bag Mensur produced a wrapped package, a silvery box tied up with a golden bow. For me. Perry studied the package. Aren't you going to open it? There was a notebook inside. A beautiful, hand-stitched turquoise notebook with sequins and a mirrored mosaic on the cover. I know you're curious about God, Mensur said pensively. I can't answer all your questions. No one can, frankly, including your mum and that cuckoo preacher of hers. He downed the rest of his Reiki in a single swallow. I have no sympathy for religion, or for the religious, but you know why I'm still fond of God. Perry shook her head. Because he is lonely, Parasim, like me, like you, Mensur replied. All alone up there somewhere, no one to talk to. Okay, maybe a few angels, but just how much fun can you have with the cherubim? Billions pray to God, oh give me victory, give me money, give me a Ferrari, do this do that, same words over and over, but hardly anyone goes to the trouble to get to know him. Mensur topped up his glass, a flash of sadness in his eyes. Think how people react when they see an accident on the road. Straight away they say, oh, heaven forbid. Can you believe it? Their first reaction is to think of themselves, not the victims. So many prayers are carbon copies of one another. Protect me, love me, support me, it's all about me. They call it piousness, I call it selfishness in disguise. At this, Perry cocked her head to one side, eager to console her father but without a clue as to how. The house sank into a quiet so delicate a puff of air would have tipped it over. Perry wondered if her mother, behind walls and from her bed, was listening to this conversation and, if so, what was going through her mind. From now on, when you have a thought about God, or about yourself, write it down in your notebook like a diary. Yes, but it'll be a special one, said Mensur, perking up. A lifelong diary. But there won't be enough pages exactly, the only way is to erase previous writings. Do you get it? Write and erase, my soul. I can't teach you not to have dark thoughts. Never really figured it out myself. Mensur paused. But I was hoping you could at least rub them out so that I can have new dark thoughts. Well, yes, new dark thoughts are better than old dark thoughts. That same night, as she sat up in bed, Perry opened her diary and wrote down her first entry. I think God comes in many pieces and colors. I can build a peaceful God, all-loving. Or I can build an angry God, punishing. Or maybe I'll build nothing. God is a Lego set. Put up and pull down. Write and erase. Believe and doubt. Was that what their father really meant? In the end it hardly mattered, for that was what Perry, harking back to that day years later, decided she had heard. Her father's teaching would solidify what she already suspected about herself, that, while some people were passionate believers and others passionate non-believers, she would always remain stuck in between. The Polaroid. Istanbul, 2016. The tramp lunged at Perry, swinging the knife so swiftly and recklessly it was a miracle she was able to dodge it. The blade missed the side of her abdomen by inches but sliced her right palm open. She let out a piercing wail, her voice cracking with pain. Blood streamed down her wrist, dripping onto her purple silk dress. Her heart pounding in her ribcage, sweat pouring down her forehead, she pushed the man with all her might. Not expecting resistance, he lost his balance, swaying momentarily, a respite Perry used to knock the knife from his hand. Enraged, he hit her in the chest with such force that for a horrible moment she couldn't breathe. She thought of her daughter, waiting in the car. She thought of her two young sons, watching their favorite TV show at home. An image of her husband swam into her head, at the dinner party surrounded by other guests, checking his watch every few minutes, sick with worry. The realization that she might never again see her loved ones brought tears to her eyes. How stupid it was to die like this. People faced death defending their countries and their flags and their honor, she defending a fake Hermes bag with a misplaced grave accent. But maybe it was all equally meaningless. The tramp punched her again, this time in the stomach. Felled, Perry coughed, nearly all her strength drained out of her. She summoned up a last reserve of willpower. Stop it! I tell you, stop now! Perry shouted as though reprimanding a misbehaving child. She was trembling, her body seemed to refuse to listen to the orders from her brain not to panic. Look, she whispered hoarsely, if you hurt me, you'll be in serious trouble. They'll put you in jail. They'll break your, she wanted to say your spirit, but instead she said your bones. Trust me, they will do that. The tramp sucked upon his teeth. Whore, he said. Who do you think you are? Nobody had ever called Perry a whore before, and the word pierced her like a splinter of ice. She made another attempt, opting for reconciliation. Keep the bag, okay? You go your way, I go mine. Whore, he repeated, stuck inside the oath. His expression darkened, his eyes became thin fissures in his face. He drew in his breath, aroused by his own thoughts. Beyond the alley, a car approached the opening, its headlights briefly carving a tunnel of escape. Perry wished to shout for help, but it was already too late. The car had disappeared. They were plunged into shadows again. She took a step back. Catching Perry by the neck, the tramp shoved her down. Her hair came loose, the pin that had been holding the bun ricocheted off the ground. A tinny, metallic sound. When she fell backwards, her head hit the asphalt from the impact. Strangely, it didn't hurt. From down here the sky seemed impossibly far and resembled a sheet of bronze, unmoving, solid, cold. She tried to get up, her hand leaving bloody prints. In a flash, he was on top of her, struggling to tear off her dress. A sour smell emanated from his mouth of hunger, cigarettes, chemicals. It was the stench of decay. Perry retched. The flesh trying to penetrate her flesh was that of a corpse. It happened all the time in this city that encompassed 7 hills, 2 continents, 3 seas, and 15 million mouths. It happened behind closed doors and in open courtyards, in cheap motel rooms and 5-star luxury suites, in the midst of the night or plain daylight. The brothels of the city could tell many a story had they only found ears willing to listen. Call girls and rent boys and aged prostitutes beaten, abused, and threatened by clients looking for the smallest excuse to lose their temper. Transsexuals who never went to the police for they knew they could be assaulted a second time. Children scared of particular family members and new brides of their fathers or brothers-in-law, Nurses and teachers and secretaries harassed by infatuated lovers just because they had refused to date them in the past, housewives who would never speak a word, for there were no words in this culture to describe marital rape. It happened all the time. Canopied under a mantle of secrecy and silence that shamed the victims and shielded the assailants, Istanbul was no stranger to sexual abuse. In this city where everyone feared outsiders, most assaults came from those who were too familiar, too close. In the ensuing minutes in the quiet of that alley, as though waking from a dream only to find herself ensnared in someone else's nightmare, Perry's perception of the events splintered into disparate layers. She fought back. She was strong. He was too, unexpectedly so from his gaunt frame. He head-butted her, knocking her unconscious for a few seconds. She could have given up, so sharp was the pain, so irresistible the urge to let despair take over. That was when she saw a silhouette out of the corner of her eye. Soft and silken, too angelic to be human. She recognized it, him. The baby in the mist. Rosy cheeks, dimpled arms, sturdy, plump legs, wispy, golden hair that had not yet turned dark. A plum-colored stain covered one cheek. A cute little infant, except he wasn't. A genie. A spirit. A hallucination. A figment of her wired, fearful imagination, although this was not their first encounter. Unaware of the apparition behind him, the tramp swore under his bray that he grappled with his trousers. Impatiently, he tugged at the rope around his waist that served as a belt. He must have knotted it too tightly. He was unable to untangle it with one hand while holding Perry with the other. The baby in the mist gurgled with delight. Through his innocent eyes Perry saw the folly she had been sucked into, the laughable misery. She chuckled loud and bold. Her reaction puzzled the tramp, who paused for a fleeting second. "Let me help you with that," Perry said, nodding towards the cord. His eyes sparkled, half disorientated, half distrustful. A flicker of condescension crossed his face. He had managed to scare her, and he knew from past experiences, fear was all it took to bring someone, anyone, from their lofty position down to their knees. He pulled away, merely an inch or two. With all her might, Perry launched herself at the man. Caught by surprise, he tumbled rearwards and fell on his back. Lithe and agile, she jumped and kicked him in the crotch. He keened like a wounded animal. Perry felt nothing, no pity, no rage. One always learned from others. Some people taught beauty, others cruelty. She couldn't tell whether it was because the intoxicant he sniffed earlier was working its way through his body weakening him, or because she was fortified by some wild and unknown energy, but she felt powerful. Unhinged. Dangerous. She rammed her foot into his face, all her strength focused on that single action. A sickening sound rang out, the crack of a nose being broken. Thesite of his blood, this time in abundance, instead of terrifying her, goaded her to hit him harder. Before she knew it, she was kicking and punching him everywhere. The tramp clutched his stomach, his coat rolled up, revealing an emaciated torso underneath. Listless and light, he endured the beating as if he were tired of the chasing, the stealing, the struggle and the pettiness of it. "You son of a bitch," Perry said under her breath. In all these years she had never cursed aloud, not since Oxford, and it felt, like the last time, surprisingly easy, sweet. The baby in the mist glided past. As evanescent as a whisper, a figurine made of the finest silks and gauzes. He was not smiling any more, his features, carved from honey-colored wax, were unmoving. Nor did he seem to judge what was happening. He was beyond such things, from outside this realm. Swiftly, and once again having helped Perry, he vanished. The vapor dissolved into the evening's gathering darkness without a trace. All at once, Perry stopped hitting the tramp. A rising breeze stirred her hair, a shrieking seagull, perhaps a distant descendant of another seagull had in the eons of time swallowed a poet's tongue, circled above angry at something or someone in the city of crowds and concrete. The man was panting, every breath like a sob. He had blood all over his face and his upper lip had split. I'm sorry, Perry thought and almost said it aloud, the words catching in her throat. In that instant, as though conditioned, she recalled a voice, loving and reprimanding at the same time. Are you still apologizing to everyone, my dear? If Professor Asa had been transported to Istanbul, that's what he would have said to her now, most likely. How bizarre it was that the past came flooding in at the very moment disorder breached the banks of the present. Random memories, repressed anxieties, untold secrets, and guilt, plenty of guilt. All her senses dimmed, the world became a blurry backdrop. Engulfed by a feeling of placidity, almost a kind of numbness, that separated her from everything else, including the pain from a place in her body she couldn't locate. Perry remembered things from her life that she thought she had forever left behind. The tramp started to weep. Gone was the emperor of the streets, the beggar, the addict, the thief, the rapist, all his roles had been stripped away, leaving behind a boy crying in the dark for a comforting touch that would never come. Now that the effect of the glue had fully worn off, physical pain had replaced hallucinations. Perry approached him, the blood pulsating in her ears, horrified at what she had done. She would have offered him help had her daughter not arrived just then. Mum, what happened? Fast as an arrow, Perry turned back. She composed herself, trying her hardest to gather her thoughts. Sweetheart, why didn't you wait in the car? How much longer could I wait? Denise said, but whatever reprimand she had in mind instantly vanished. Oh my God, you are bleeding. What on earth happened? Are you okay? I'm fine, Perry said. We had a bit of a scuffle. The tramp, now deadly quiet, staggered to his feet and stumbled over to a corner, showing no more interest in them. Mother and daughter picked up the handbag and as many of its scattered contents as they could find. Why can't I have a normal mother like everyone else? Denise muttered to herself, as she scooped up credit cards off the ground. It was a question Perry could not answer, and therefore did not try. Let's go, Denise said. Just a second. Perry's eyes cast around for the Polaroid, but it seemed to have disappeared. Come on, Denise yelled. What's wrong with you? Leaving the alley, they hurried back to their car. The Monte Carlo blue Range Rover was waiting for them, miraculously unstolen. The rest of the ride continued in silence, the daughter picking at her fingernails, the mother with her eyes fixed on the road. Only later would it occur to Perry that they had not retrieved her mobile phone. Maybe the tramp still had it in his pocket, maybe it had fallen out during their struggle, and somewhere in that alley it was flashing and ringing. Yet another cry that went unheard in Istanbul. The Garden, Istanbul, 1980s. The first time Perry saw the baby in the mist she was 8 years old. The encounter would change her forever, intertwine itself through her life like a vine through a young tree. It would also be the beginning of a series of experiences that, though familiar because of their similarity, would become no less frightening over the years. Unlike most houses in the vicinity, the Nalbantaglus was surrounded by a lush garden on 4 sides. It was at the back that they spent most of their time outside. That was where they hung red peppers and aubergines and okra on strings to dry in the sun, prepared jar upon jar of spicy tomato sauce, and steamed sheep's heads in cauldrons on Eid al-Adha. Perry would try hard not to look at the sheep's eyes, open and unblinking. Her throat would tighten at the thought that whoever ate those eyes would also ingest the horror they had witnessed seconds before being slaughtered. The idea was doubly disturbing, since she knew it would be her father who would consume the delicacy that evening at his Reiki table. It was also here that they piled up raw wool, then aired, washed, and beat with sticks before stuffing it into mattresses. Occasionally, a bit of fluff would break free from the rest and gently fall onto someone's shoulder like a feather from a shot pigeon. When Perry had confessed to her father that the raw wool reminded her of dying birds and that the eyes of sheep stared at her accusingly, Mensur had smiled and given her a peck on the cheek. Don't be so sensitive, Kanaminisai *. Don't take life too seriously, as if he himself were any different. A wooden, unpainted fence, with posts so wide apart that it resembled a mouth with missing teeth, separated their property from the outside world. Of all the activities in the garden, Perry's favorite, after the games she played with other children, was the day of communal carpet washing. How she longed for that time to arrive, which would happen every few months. The weather had to be clement, neither too dry nor too damp, the carpets sufficiently dirty, and everyone in the right mood. One such day, all the carpets and rugs had been rolled up and dragged outside, where they were laid out on the grass, side by side. Hand-knotted, flat-woven or factory-produced, there were about 12 of them to wash. Thrust into a universe of symmetrical knots, central medallions and hidden symbols, the children of Mute Poet Street leaped back and forth with squeals of laughter, sailing across oceans and into ports on their flying carpets. Meanwhile, in a separate corner, an uncovered cast iron cauldron boiled in an open fire. Bowls of water were drawn from it and poured onto the rugs to soften the fabric. Next each would be soaped, brushed, scrubbed and rinsed. Again and again. Not all the women took part in the drudgery. Perry's mother, for one, stood to one side, finding the job too tedious and too messy for her taste. Others, the brave and the diligent, had already turned up their shalwars and skirts, their faces flushed with the importance of their mission, their hair no longer contained by their headscarves, their bare feet flattening the deep shag pile of the rugs as though trampling through a field of young barley. Over the ensuing hours the children built castles from mud, trapped flies using matchboxes smeared with jam, ate apricots, and crushed the kernels, and watermelon, and dried the seeds, made wreaths from pine needles, and chased a tawny cat that was either overweight or heavily pregnant. Then they ran out of things to do, but so far only a third of the carpets had been thoroughly cleaned. One by one Perry's friends went home, to return later in the day. This being her garden, her house, she stayed. A beautiful day it was, bright and warm. Spilling, splashing, the wind was saturated with the sounds of water. The women gossiped, chuckled and sang. Someone made lewd jokes, which Perry could not work out but guessed must have been naughty by the scowl on her mother's face. In the afternoon the carpet cleaners took a break to have lunch. They carried out the food that had been prepared beforehand: stuffed cabbage leaves, borek with feta, pickled cucumbers, cracked bulgur salad, grilled meatballs, apple cookie rolls. A large round tray was brought out on which each dish was placed amidst stacks of flat bread and glasses of Aaron * white and foamy like dollops of cloud from the hands of a generous god. Feeling ravenous, Perry snatched a borek from the plate. She had barely bitten into it when a desperate shriek pierced the air. Her mother, in her haste and distraction, had bumped into the boiling cauldron, remarkably managing not to knock it over onto herself. But her left arm was burned from elbow to fingertips. Dropping whatever they were doing, the other women rushed to Selma's help. Pour cold water on her arm, said someone. Toothpaste. Smear it all over the burn vinegar, that's how we healed my aunt's burns. Hers were worse, said someone else. With everyone scampering inside to attend to Selma in the best way they knew how, Perry was left alone in the garden. A strip of sunlight fell across her face, an insect hummed its drowsy way nearby. Under a fig tree on the opposite side of the road she spotted the tawny cat, its jade eyes narrowed to mere slits. It occurred to her to feed the animal. Grabbing a meatball, Sheklim bed over the fence. In a flash, she was outside. What's your name, little girl? Perry turned to find a young man in a red and white check shirt and blue denims that appeared never to have been washed. The beret he wore seemed about to slide off his head. She didn't respond at first, for she knew better than to talk to strangers. But she didn't walk away either. The beret intrigued her, reminding her of the poster in Umit's room. Maybe this stranger was a revolutionary. Maybe he had heard about her brother, Andy's fate. She decided if she didn't tell him the truth, it wouldn't quite be giving him information. So she said, "I'm Rosa. Oh, I never met a Rosa before," he said, his face tilted towards the sun, "and a very pretty one too." "You'll break hearts when you grow up." Perry said nothing, though something stirred inside her, a tiny swell of sensuality, a force not yet awake, half thrilled, half repelled by the compliment. "You like cats, I can see," he said. His voice was small, brittle. Later on, though not at that moment, Perry would liken it to the bean she kept inside moist cotton wool by the window ledge. Just like that bean, the stranger's voice was hiding, changing, germinating. I saw a furball around the corner, he said. She has given birth to 5 kittens, apparently. They are so cute and teeny, like mice. They have pinkies. Feigning indifference, Perry offered the cat the last piece of meatball. The man came a step closer. He smelled of tobacco, of sweat, of damp soil. He crouched down and smiled at her. They were now at the same eye level. It's a pity their mother will drown them. Perry held her breath. Down in the field, where stray dogs roamed and a few goats grazed, there was a reservoir no one used because whenever it rained more than 3 inches it became contaminated with sewage. She glanced in that direction, half expecting to see feline bodies floating on theater. Cats do that, the man said with a sigh. Perry couldn't help asking, but why? They don't like pink eyes, he replied. His own were light brown with hollowed skin underneath, and closely set on his angular face. They fear they have given birth to strange creatures, like fox cubs. So they kill them. Perry wondered if fox cubs had pink eyes and, if so, what their mothers thought about that. In her family she was the only one with green eyes and felt lucky that no one had seen this as a problem, so far. The man, observing her bewilderment, stroked the cat's head before he stood up. I better go and check on the kittens. They need looking after. Would you like to join me? Who? Me, she said, only because she didn't know what else to say. He pursed his lips, taking his time to reply, as though it were she who had suggested coming with him. You can, if you want. But they are very small. Do you promise to be careful not to hurt them? Promise, she said airily. A window opened somewhere. A woman yelled into the wind, threatening her son if he did not come home for lunch this very minute she would break both his legs. The man, suddenly nervous, looked left and right. His face narrowed as he said, we mustn't be seen together. I'll walk ahead, you keep behind me. The kittens. Where are they? They're not far, but it's better if we drive. My car is just around the corner. He gestured vaguely before quickening his footsteps. Perry started to follow the man, who had a distinct limp. Though a part of her had qualms about what she was doing, this was the first decision she had made without her parents, and the closest she had come to a sense of freedom. Soon, with an evasive glance over his shoulder, he reached his car and got into the driver's seat, waiting for her. Perry stopped, alerted by something less intuitive than physical. She's huddered as though an icy wind had touched her bare skin. But what startled her the most was the mist that had descended from nowhere. A curtain of fog, layers upon layers of grey, like rolls of cloth unfurled in a draper's store. The fog confused her, momentarily, as to where she was going and why. She could detect the milky silhouette of a tree nearby, but the world beyond that was not visible anymore, including the man, only a few feet away. Inside the cloud of grey, Perry beheld the strangest sight, a baby, his face round, open, trusting. A purple stain extended from one cheek down to his jaw. He had some liquid dribbling from the corner of his mouth, as if he had just thrown up a little. Perry, where are you? Her mother's voice, laden with panic, wafted from our cherry-colored house. She couldn't answer. Her heart pulsed in the hollow of her throat as she blinked in bewilderment at the baby in the mist. It must be a spirit, a genie, she thought. She had heard of them, creatures made of smokeless fire. They were here long before Adam and Eve were sent tumbling down from the Garden of Eden, so, historically speaking, the earth belonged to them. Humans were the latecomers, the invaders. The jinn lived in remote areas, snowy mountains, dark caves, arid wastelands, but they often found their way into the city to inhabit stinking toilets, grimy cellars, fusty vaults. Since they wandered freely, one had to tread with care. Stepping on one of them by mistake was sure to end badly, probably in paralysis. Perhaps that was what had happened to her too. She could barely move. Perry. Answer me. Selma shouted. The baby in the mist recoiled as if he had recognized the voice. Thegrenis began to dissolve. So did the baby himself, bit by bit, like a morning haze under rays of the rising Sunday. Here, mother. Perry turned and ran back as fast as she could towards their garden. She would ask around, afterwards, if anyone in the neighborhood knew about any kittens with pink eyes. No one did. Later, much later in life, Perry understood she had missed by a hair's breadth becoming another item in a newspaper. Nameless, save for her printed initials, NN, her photo with a black band over her eyes. She could have been there, next to the reports about a deadly attack on a mafia leader in Istanbul, the clash between the Turkish army and the Kurdish separatists in a town along the southeast border, and the court decision to ban Henry Miller's Tropic of Capricorn. The whole nation would read the details of her abduction, knocking on wood, shaking their heads, clucking their tongues, thanking God that it was someone else's child and not theirs. She called her savior the baby in the mist and left it at that, neither able nor willing to grasp from where it had sprung. But the vision kept returning, at unexpected intervals throughout her life. It appeared not only when she was in danger but during ordinary moments as well. Indoors or outdoors, morning or night, the fog could descend at any time on anywhere, hedging her in on every side as if it wanted her to acknowledge once and for all, how lonely she really was. Years later, it was the secret she would carry in her suitcase when, at the age of 19, she traveled to Oxford University for the first time. You were not allowed to bring meat or dairy products into England from outside European countries, but no one said you couldn't bring along your childhood fears and traumas.